What I wanted to talk about this morning is public-private sector tensions in the geospatial industry. Now, several of the different communities that have come here, such as the GPS community, space communications community, the remote sensing community, of course, are familiar with public and private sector tensions that they've struggled with. But I think it's interesting that at this conference that we're seeing the overlaps between those different communities, and I just kind of wanted to highlight the three of the biggest ones that I think that we'll be struggling with. Geospatial applications, have and continue to experience tensions in the licensing process for commercial remote sensing, which has its Cold War origins. There's conflicts over the sharing of environmental data, that is open data sharing, which is important for science, of course, is coming up against the desires of the private sector to have their own commercial markets. And finally, the spectrum upon which we all depend is under pressure from many mobile terrestrial uses of that spectrum. So really all space users are finding themselves having to compete with other terrestrial sources that impact all of us. The global trends that you've been hearing about in this conference are really part of a whole larger series of things affecting all information and aerospace technologies. Access to space-based information capabilities is become virtually ubiquitous. Private capital and sovereign wealth funds are reshaping the international space markets. The amount of investment funds available for major U.S. information technology firms is such that they can really acquire any space-based information technology that they really may want. Apple, Google, Bing, and so forth quite dwarf the size of many other sort of specialty niche players that they may want. And along with capital sources, international models of satellite ownership are also changing. So countries are increasingly able to satisfy their space data and communication needs through services from satellites that they don't necessarily own. The interesting new source of demand that's come to this market, as all of you are, I think, no doubt aware, is the growth of big data and location-based services. These are not necessarily space people per se. They don't really particularly care about space. But what they do care is about information and about the decision-making that they can make based upon space-based information services. And so that bringing in of new sources of demand and energy has been something that's been, I think, revolutionizing the space parts of the community. The fusion of data from multiple sources is allowing motivated nations, multinational corporations, even small groups of individuals to improve the access to previously unavailable information that can have strategic implications. Again, in the old days, we would think of the use of space to get access to denied areas, literally denied areas that there was no way of getting to. Today, the undiscovered country is the denied area is found in data cubes. That is, there's information available across spatial, temporal, and frequency ranges that we don't really know about, and we're running our algorithms against those data cubes looking for patterns and relationships that otherwise would have been hidden to us. Now, in this world, unfortunately, since this is a policy section, the U.S. government is adapting rather slowly to these changes, both to mitigate harm to a new industrial base that's more suited to maybe unique but increasingly expensive and slow government approaches. And at the same time, the government is not really effectively positioning itself well to leverage the new capabilities and opportunities to benefit from these trends. And so while the space and geospatial industries are not necessarily synonymous with each other, they share a number of common challenges. And again, as I've listed, the licensing processes, the sharing of open data, and spectrum. Agencies continue to harbor the view that space-based assets should be considered differently from a wide range of other emerging sensors, particularly drones, unmanned air vehicles, terrestrial systems, within a rapidly changing geospatial ecosystem. Now, this is historically understandable because where did satellites come from? They came from the satellite reconnaissance demand and the needs of Cold War strategic confrontation. But that history isn't necessarily the reality we have today, although we still have strategic problems. And the U.S. needs to tailor its policies and regulations because, again, satellites are not as unique as they once were. In many ways, the U.S. has achieved the objectives it set out to achieve in the aftermath of the Cold War with the 1992 Land Remote Sensing Policy Act and with the later 1994 Presidential Decision Directives on commercial remote sensing, that is, making high-resolution commercial systems available. At the time, I was in the Commerce Department at the end of Bush 1, and we would have been thrilled if we thought there'd be two competitive companies out there in the field. And so in many respects, we've really succeeded beyond our expectations. Today, I'm a member of the NOAA Advisory Committee on Commercial Remote Sensing, ACRES, and we've been taking note of these global trends that are out there in technology and money and markets. And while noting the world is very, very different, of course, we've been pointing out that the world is not, that the U.S. government is not really keeping up. One of the regulations, for example, that was written back in my day when dinosaurs ruled the earth was, inspecting ground stations. Well, that seemed reasonable when ground stations were big and they had big antennas and they moved sort of slowly. Well, today a ground station might be your iPad. So the kinds of rules that we wrote at the time about inspecting ground stations don't really necessarily match the world we're in today. In this environment, looking at space systems in isolation, I think misses the real-world blending that those of you here at this conference have been seeing. Many advanced capabilities, GPS, data from cell phones, UAVs, social media, and others are coming together in ways where really the satellite portion is only one small but still important part of this environment, and we haven't kept up with that. Another area that we haven't kept up with is in the sharing of environmental data. Data from Landsat and weather satellites was used initially for scientific and then later other public purposes. As we recognize the value of that, of course, there's an attempt to try to monetize that flow, and we're all familiar with the Landsat experiment when we finally kind of came to our senses and said, no, the national benefit is actually much better if we simply make this data freely available. The taxpayer already paid for it once, why are we paying for it again? And while that might have been bad for an individual agency, it turned out to be good for the nation. Particularly good for the nation because if you think about it, Uncle Sam is really a 30% owner by the tax rates in pretty much every corporation. So the more the economy grows, the more Uncle Sam benefits. That certainly has helped in the GPS community, and I think it's helped now in the remote sensing community. Now, the United States has been a leader in openly sharing environmental data from civil scientific satellites with researchers worldwide. The United States is a strong supporter of the data sharing principles that are in the group on Earth observation, and we'll hear more from Barbara, I think, about that. And this is widely practiced in many countries, not as widely as I think as many of us would like, because some countries still think they can monetize their databases somehow. And of course, we want to kind of encourage them to be hopefully more enlightened. But on the other hand, there are sources of data that government agencies are probably not going to have the money to pay for, and NOAA certainly is not going to have the money to pay for, which could be provided by the private sector that do have the ability to have also meet commercial markets. And now, one of my favorites, since I'm a GPS guy, is of course GPS radio occultation. I know there's a couple of different companies, in that area. When I was in the Commerce Department, I had arguments with my colleagues in NOAA over buying wind profile data. And again, there was sort of this idea that if it was important enough to spend government money on, it was important enough for the government to have to own that entire capability. Of course, today we realize there's data sources that are really important to the government for improving public purposes like weather satellite weather predictions, but where the government probably either doesn't need to or can't afford to own that capability. So we wind up asking ourselves, what's really important? Is it improving scientific understanding? Is it improving our weather prediction models? Or is it to advance other good purposes, such as open sharing of data, which we also would like to have? So I think one of the questions agencies are struggling with is how to prioritize these different and at times competing policy priorities in moving themselves forward. One of the subtle effects that you get from purchasing data as opposed to ownership of the satellite, however, is that there becomes a shift in the role of the agency, and sometimes it's an uncomfortable one, toward that of being a consumer of data or a consumer of a product rather than a customer. Now, if I'm a customer, I get to specify a lot about what should be there, what kind of characteristics it has. I get to maybe have some say, even if it costs me money in change orders. If I'm a consumer, I consume what is provided to me. And that sort of relationship, particularly in doing public benefit activities like weather prediction, is not always being a comfortable one. I would submit there's an additional piece of analysis that agencies are going to have to do, which is that of build or buy. In some cases, it's going to make sense to go out and build your own system because that's what you really need to own and control. In other cases, you're going to be better off buying it and outsourcing it, again, with a downside, with a loss of control, potential risk to your own internal intellectual capital as a result. But those build or buy decisions are ones companies make all the times, and I would argue that agencies are also going to need to make that decision. Finally, I want to put in a note, people know I could go for at least another hour on radio spectrum. I won't do that. But this is a major source of risk affecting public and private sector remote sensing entities alike. There is a massive, massive push, as you know, for mobile broadband. Streaming video, not only for UAVs, but also for Netflix, is something, and there's billions and billions of dollars in here. And as a result, there's a hunt for spectrum. Now, it turns out some spectrum, which is globally allocated, really clean, and in really desirable areas, happens to be where there are space services. And therefore, all space services are being hunted for use of spectrum. GPS has tended to be kind of the canary in the coal mine because it exists in the 1 to 3 gigahertz range, which is particularly attractive. But really all MEDAIDs, EESS, RNSS systems, those of you in the ITU business recognize those acronyms. And therefore, there is a pressure on the ecosystem from one part, communications, on other parts, remote sensing and navigation, when in fact we need all of them. We need all of these things to work. The emerging world and the developed world needs all of these things in there, but the money pressure cannot be underestimated, and therefore the protection of spectrum is something that's fairly foundational, and I would argue that this community in particular should be working with satellite companies, aviation interests, government agencies, to prevent incursions and interference to that spectrum upon which it relies. It would be foolish in the extreme and naive to think that someone else or the government will protect your spectrum dependencies for you. I can assure you there's no one who's going to look out for your interests more than you will yourself. And if you think somebody else is going to do your job for you, you're going to lose. So in the end, I'll just leave you with a series of questions, which is, as we think about regulation of commercial remote sensing and geospatial companies in general, really what's the purpose? Why is there any regulation at all? And there's some, national security, foreign policy, public safety, things one can think of, but we should be thinking very fundamentally about why are we doing regulation, for what purpose? Second, how can we reevaluate the regulation of commercial remote sensing satellites to avoid unintended harm to US interests in a world that's changing very rapidly? And then finally, again, fundamentally, what are the areas really beyond frequency allocations and orbital management, maybe space debris? Do we really require regulation, and why? Again, in a world where I've got drones, I've got Google Street View, where the number of denied areas is really small. North Korea comes to mind, but it's really pretty tiny from where it once was. And so therefore, there may be some special niche areas, but maybe in general, we should think about competing much more hard and rather than trying to slow things down. With that, thank you.